The Amstrad 8256 is a complete word processor. It has a big 256K memory, a high-resolution monitor with built-in disk drive, and inclusive word processing software, as well as a fully integrated printer. Yet it costs just £399 plus VAT. When you update the office, shouldn't you make room for one? The Amstrad 8256, more than a word processor, for less than most typewriters.
Hi, and indeed, more than a word processor. All the way from 1985, Amstrad 8256. I bought this ages ago, probably even a couple of years ago, as a parts only thing on eBay, but I got it and I plugged it in and it worked, and that's as far as I got. And I stuck it on a bench and I've never looked at it since. But I had plans for this, and I think now's the time to put them into action. And I've been looking at this afternoon, and it's a really interesting machine, entertaining machine as well, not just a business thing. So let's check it out. So this thing has quite a lot going on, really. At the front, there's not much. There's a brightness knob for the screen, but on the back, we've got at the top left printer connector. So the little square at the top is the power input. So it takes its power straight from the power supply inside the machine. And below that, we've got the data ribbon for the printer. Center bottom, we've got horizontal and vertical sync. And then to the left, we've got this expansion connector. And apparently there's a bunch of peripherals you could get. You could even use joysticks on this, and there's quite a big gaming scene on this. We'll go into that a bit later as well. But you could add serial parallel ports, mice, all that kind of stuff. So it was quite an expandable little thing. So not only does it have quite a few funky sort of expansion possibilities on the back, it also has some expansion possibilities inside. And so we're going to open it up and we're going to upgrade the memory. Apparently this thing has slots for an extra 256K of RAM, so you can upgrade it to 512. I've got chips for that, so we're going to do that. The other thing I wanted to take a look at was the floppy drive, because the floppy drives are pretty rare for these. This one works, but I'm concerned that the belt might be in a bad state, so I want to take a look at it, because I did a video a while back. I had a PCW8512, which is a sort of later machine than this, and it was a bit of a pain, and I had a whole bunch of drives for that, and all of the belts had literally, the kind of rubber they made them out of had disintegrated and melted and actually glued itself to the flywheel in the drive. So I want to make sure none of that's going on with this machine. And it also has an expansion bay for a second floppy drive, which I don't have anything for that at the minute, but that's something to think about in the future, or maybe pop a GoTech in there. Now, this is a CRT, and there are risks involved in going inside of these things. So, we've got our anode down there where you'd normally do your discharge, and I haven't discharged this one. And you've got the power supply down the bottom there with potentially some capacitors still holding a charge, etc. But the motherboard and the drive are off to one side, so I think I should safely be able to get at them. I'm just being lazy. So everything should be good, as long as I don't slip and electrocute myself. But yeah, that's the way we're going to do it. Clear some of the cables away. So we've taken the cables out the back of the drive. You can see the motherboard quite clearly now. I'm not quite sure what to take out first or how they come out. And there you can see the empty bank for the extra 256K of RAM that we'll be putting in a second. So all of the PCWs use Z80s as their CPUs, and I think the very later models run at 16 megahertz, but this particular one here is a Z80A, and it's a 4 megahertz part. Chip labelled Amstrad 40026 here. I believe this is actually an Intel part that's been rebranded, but this is the printer controller. Some of them have labels above the sockets, but not all of them. Below that, there's this other chip called marked, SED9420C. I think this is like a data handler that works in conjunction with the floppy disk controller to just pass stuff backwards and forwards from the floppy drive. There's another chip from Zilog here, and FDC, so this has to be the floppy disk controller itself. And there's a crystal oscillator there, so that's KSS8E, so I guess that's the 8 megahertz clock for the 4 megahertz CPU. We got this other Amstrad chip, so this is 40028, and this is one of their custom chips. Who knows what it does? Not me. And you can just see underneath the power connector that the board is dated 1985. Probably have to get this power connector out. I tried to move it before, but it's pretty wedged in there. So wedged in fact, I had to get a little screwdriver and prise it out because it kind of blocks me getting the screwdriver down the back of the floppy drive to get the last screw out there. And once that was out of the way, it was easy to get the last screw out, and we can lift the floppy drive out, and it looks like the motherboard just kind of slides in and is held in on a single little clip, so we can slide that out as well. Okay, the motherboard's flat on the bench, and I should really do some planning for these videos, because it would have been much easier now to show you the motherboard now that it's out in the daylight instead of trying to do it inside the case, but what can you do? Now, it should be quite an easy job just to shove these memory modules in, and that'll be the motherboard upgraded. Cool, all the memory's in, so that's a 512K machine now, a monster. And we can see much more clearly now the date on the motherboard, so yeah, 1985 copyright. And there's a BP speaker next to it as well. These 3-inch floppy drives are funny things. Like, there's a load of like shielding around it, so it's not kind of a self-contained thing. There's a sort of outer shield and then an inner shield, and then that reveals all of the bits and pieces inside. So on first inspection, this thing looks pretty good. The belt looks immaculate, so I can only imagine somebody must have replaced this at some point, because there's no degradation on there at all. It does look rather new. I can't see any obvious problems with any of the components. I can't see any capacitors that are leaking. In fact, I can't see any capacitors at all, so you know, there might not be any electrolytic capacitors on there that potentially leak. Keeping my fingers away from the stepper motor and things in case I knock them out of kilter. Really, all I think it needs is a bit of IPA just to wipe away a bit of the dust that's gathered in there, give the heads a quick clean, and good to put it back together and get it back inside. And back together it went. And again, a bit of planning might have come in handy here, because you're supposed to do your research before you start these things, but I do my research after, it seems. So I had the lid back on it and was sitting there, funnily enough, waiting for my camera to cool off because it overheated. And I was reading about this, and then I did actually see a set of dip switches on the motherboard, but didn't really pay much attention to them. And you need to change those. You need to change it to tell the machine that it's got 512K instead of 256. So I've got to take it apart again. So the lid came off, the dip switches were changed, and then put it all back together again for the final time this time, I hope. Now, there isn't really an easy way to tell what your memory is on these machines without getting a special sort of diagnostic program to check your memory, which I don't have. I've ordered one because there was one on eBay, but it's not going to be here for a few days. So the best you can do at the minute is when you load the machine, it allocates some of the RAM to be a RAM disk. So when we booted it up the first time, you can see that the RAM disk size was 112K, and now that we've upgraded the RAM and you boot it up again, you can see that the RAM drive has gone up to 368K. So 368K was more than the total memory that was in the machine to begin with. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that that RAM upgrade has been successful. Now, earlier we saw that there were attachments for a proprietary printer for this machine, and I've got one here, so I'm going to hook it up now so that the system is complete and we can give it a go and try and print something in a little while, and hopefully there's some ink left in the ribbon. Who knows, after what, 30 years or something. Now the system's complete, time to boot it up into its operating system, which is CP/M. So there's a big hoo-ha whether or not MS-DOS or DOS came from CP/M originally or not. A lot of people have kind of debunked it, but there's a bit of a urban myth that that's how it happened. There are some similarities, so you've got things like the dir command are the same and do the same thing, but by and large this is a much simpler thing. Now, I've never seen the very early versions of DOS, but I imagine they're kind of similar. It's very limited to a bunch of commands for file handling and printer setup and a few other things like that. There is one cool thing in here, that's palette.com. So palette, you can change the palette of the screen, surprisingly enough, which isn't that exciting because you've only got two colors in the palette, green and black. So you can switch it. So you can either have black on green or green on black. But I think green on black looks much more sci-fi, so we're going to roll with that. Okay, so what we've done is we've done a dir on the disc, and I should have said earlier, actually, these discs are double-sided, so they're very cool little things. I don't know whether anybody else ever used them apart from Amstrad, but these 3-inch discs feel all round like a more solid and robust and better thing than the 3.5-inch discs that we used to using on other machines like the PC, the Amiga and the ST. They also, the ones that I've got anyway, or the ones that I bought, seem to generally hold their data better, so I don't know whether they have better oxide coating or whatever, or they just seem to be more solid little things, so it's a shame they never really took off in any other way. These disk drives, 3-inch drives, I think I've said before, they're incredibly hard to find, so I've got a bunch of them, and this is the only one that works. Hopefully, long may it continue. So looking at the files sort of we've got listed here in the dir, this is all of the stuff that's on side A of the disk. So we've got CPM and we've got basic. So Mallard basic is a basic implementation that lets you do your coding and stuff, which you can see there, basic.com at the top right. A whole bunch of other COM files on here, which are executables that do a lot of pretty simple stuff like file handling, copying, sort of editing, that kind of thing. We've got some language settings. We can control some of the stuff from the printer controller, and we've got our palette control that we just had a look at. Not really much exciting. There is one BAS file in there, which is a basic file. That's RPED, so that's a lightweight little text editor, I think, which you can either run through the basic interpreter itself or with a slightly changed command, run command, when you run it from CPM. Now, exciting, time to turn the disc over. I think this I can't remember what this disc was called. They called it a good day disc or a good morning disc or something like that. It's a basic startup disc that came with these machines, and it was always the same. You got basic and CPM on one side of the disc, and you got Locoscript on the other side of the disc, which is what we're going to take a look at now. And Locoscript was a basic word processor. I think it looks very cool. You can either kind of see it's menu driven, which is nice, and then you've got a load of hotkey commands as well across the top. So if we go to create a new document, and then we can type some stuff in. What a fabulous little computer this is, if I could spell. And this gives us a perfect opportunity to try out that printer and see if it works. So we'll stick in a sheet of paper, and then we'll try and figure out how to print, as he frantically searches through every menu to try and find out how to do it. I should also say that these machines were designed to be extremely simple to use, but you do need the manual, and I do have the manual. I believe the manual was written in such a way that Alan Sugar, the guy who owned Amstrad, wanted it so that even he could read it, and I don't think he was particularly computer literate, so it had to be written in a way that anybody could pick it up and follow it through. And I have to say that is probably true. When I first went through the manual, the one thing that threw me was the difference between return and enter, because on a PC generally when you enter you use the return key, though the PC does have an enter key on the numeric keyboard. It tends to be for sort of numeric stuff on the right hand side, so you just don't have to move your hand, whereas on here they have very different purposes. So after originally thinking that I was doing something stupid or the book was wrong and bashing away on the return key, I realised that you actually use the enter on the numeric keyboard. Though when you look at this thing closely, it isn't a numeric keyboard really, because it's part of the main keyboard. It's not separated the way it would be on a PC. So I should have known if it says enter on the key and it says enter in the book, you should use the enter key. Anyway, I think it was on exit that you actually found the print, though I should have looked in the manual. It would have been a lot quicker. But there we go. Listen to that. The dulcet tones of a dot matrix printer. Beautiful sound. And yeah, it's got some ink. It's a bit faint. It's got some ink and it printed and it's legible. I do have some loose ink that I bought specifically for re-inking these things, so I'll be giving that a go at some point in the future. I kind of thought with this machine, I'm usually collecting games and music software and stuff for the other stuff I've got. I'm going to keep this one kind of business focused. I'm going to buy quite a lot of business software for this. So one of the first things I got was this. It's called the Full Poly System, and this is brand new. It's never been used, so the discs are still sealed in a little envelope at the back. And we've got a lot of interesting stuff here. It's nice looking at this stuff because it's from a different era. So we've got a little software house in Essex making this kind of stuff for, you know, businesses in the UK, presumably, because it would be language specific. They may have had language packs, because I believe these machines were mostly in the UK, and they were everywhere in the UK at the time, but they were also made by a company called Schneider, I think, over in Europe, and they called theirs the Joyce, as opposed to the PCW8255. Called the Joyce, I think, because that was the name of Alan Sugar's secretary at the time. But yeah, basically similar stuff, big in Europe, big in the UK, not big anywhere else, I don't think. But yeah, look at this. So you've got this little paperback software, they were called, and in Essex, you know, just probably a small place with a couple of coders knocking out business software. So it was a different world back then, before you had all these conglomerates ruling everything. Okay, so let's get these things out of their little envelope and stick them in. So usually when you load a disk in these things, at least in my experience, you type menu, and menu gives you a list of a predefined menu of what you can run. So it kind of bypasses going in directly and running the executable file itself, but it doesn't have this on this machine, or this disk I should say. So I've just done a dir on the disk, and we can see there's one executable, pp. So pp.com, let's run it, and shite, it doesn't work. So having said these disks are robust, here we've got one that isn't. So that's a bit of a shame. I do know that this Poly system is around. There's quite a lot of these unopened versions on eBay, and they're cheap, so I might get another one and try my luck just to see if I can get it working. But yeah, it's a shame. It'll just have to go onto the shelf as just a collector's item to peruse for now. So we've got another bit of business software here. One which is close to my heart, because I've got a lot to do with this company over the years, because they're local. So Sage, or Sage Soft as they were now, they're now Sage, and they're a big multinational company now. If you're in the States, you might, well, I think they might have changed their name to Sage, but they bought up accountancy companies like Peachtree and stuff like that. So they're quite big in the States, and big in Australia, and big in Africa, big everywhere now. But it all started at humble beginnings, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right at this very moment. And at this point in time, in the sort of early mid-80s, they were a very small company, started by a university graduate here. And one of the first things that they produced was this, which was Sage Retrieve, which is a database software that I have a plan for. There's a lot of stuff in the box here, but most of it is, you can see how this company became big, because they're already, you kind of get the feeling reading through this stuff that they want the money out of your pocket, and they want it now. So they're trying to railroad you onto support schemes and railroad you into buying more of their stuff sort of as soon as you open the box, where the other one seemed much more low key. Interestingly, there's two things in here. There's a cassette tape, and there's the 3-inch floppy containing the software. They've gone to no expense with this as well. You can see how they just bought a normal Amstrad disc, an Amstrad blank disc, and just stuck a Sage sticker over the top of it. Things were simpler back then. But the cassette is interesting because this is your tutorial. So instead of, there is a big thick book in here, but what they've got is a voice coach, and you stick it in a cassette recorder with a tape counter, and you work through it being told what to do as opposed to being read what to do, which is kind of a cool idea in its own way. I don't think I've ever seen that before anywhere. You just type database in here to run the executable, so there's no menu on this one either, and it fires up and it wants your personal details, your name and address, etc. So it actually took me a couple of times to do this, because this is classically shit software design. Is it allows you start typing in your address, but if you make a mistake, it offers you no way to go back and correct it, which is kind of rubbish. But anyway, I got there in the end. I've never really looked at this before, but the options that give you are to enter a database layout, enter record details, and the inquiry processor. So what I guess this is a flat file database where you define how your file needs to look. And yes, you can see if we go into there, it's basically just asking you what the name of it. So this is kind of the equivalent of a table, except there's not going to be any relationship between the tables. You say how many columns you want and what you want the various titles and things to do, and then you set security on it so that only certain people can update it and delete stuff and what have you. So basically it's a flat file database where you're just going to have a single record and you're going to record stuff, and you just give it names and titles. I guess that once you've defined that, that's kind of your schema, as it were, then you go back and you use the other option, which is the enter record details, to use that layout to pump data into it and create several files containing different records of information. And then the inquiry processor uses some kind of word matching or something to generate some kind of reporting on it. Now, my plan for this is to use this database to catalog and record all of my retro stuff. So I'm going to use this ancient computer in this ancient flat file database to keep track of my graphics cards, my components, my machines, which one's got what inside, etc., if I can. So that's going to be an interesting little project that I shall look forward to doing in the future. I'll probably do another video on it at that point. Now, surprisingly, gaming was a big thing on the PCWs, and I guess it was because these things were so cheap, as it said in the advert at the beginning, compared to the competition for business anyway. So, you know, your IBMs were costing £1,000 and rocketing upwards, whereas these things were £300. So there were lots of them around at the time in offices and also, I guess, in home offices. So a lot of kids had access to these machines, and therefore the gaming industry decided to port quite heavily to these machines. So you got a lot of games from other machines, like I guess at the time you would have had your sort of Spectrums, your Dragon 32s and things like that kicking around, and a lot of those games got ported to this machine. Now they're hard to find, and when I first got this machine, the first port of call was something cheap and quick, and there were people selling these discs. So these discs are not originals from back in the day. These are modern sort of recordings of games, which are the kind that you'd probably have seen in, you know, the listings that used to get in magazines back then, that you'd have to type in the code yourself and then compile the game, and then you'd be able to play it. And that's kind of the vibe I get from these games. So on one side you've got games written in machine code, which I guess run at a reasonable rate, and on the other side you've got games written in BASIC, which I guess run like shit. But let's have a look at some of those. So the first one is a Star Trek game, which I was quite sort of keen to take a look at because I like Star Trek. And I remember playing a game very similar to this. I think it was on a Tandy or a ZX80 or something when I was at school. And it was the same kind of monochrome grid-based game. But this is quite a meaty game. The instructions are not lightweight, and to hold them in your head or to keep on popping backwards and forwards to the help screen would be quite a big deal for a kid. But it does look like quite a deep game, quite a fun game actually. I had a bit of a mess about with it, so that's definitely one I'll come back to, but you know, nothing graphically exciting going on here. And the rest of the game, they're a bit of a mishmash. I haven't looked at them all. So you've got everything's ASCII characters, so you know there's no real graphics going on here. You've got a sort of basic version of Pac-Man. You've got a basic version of Space Invaders. None of it looks particularly good. The Space Invaders written in BASIC it runs like a pig. I mean, there's no way you push the button and it takes about a second for your little gun to move across. So yeah, the Star Trek game looks interesting on this, but I don't think I'm going to be spending much time with any of the other stuff. You get what you pay for, so spend a little bit more money, and this time it's just a single game and Space Invaders. But yeah, no, this is more like it. So what we've got here is some proper graphics. It's a properly written game, works very smoothly, and is really fun to play. So that's sort of hinting at what this machine might be capable of, and this is definitely one I would play again and again. And finally we come to the real thing. So this is Rainbird game, and they released a lot of stuff, some awesome games. I'll show you some of just screen grabs of other people's things to show you what it can do. But yeah, this is a proper game, and 3 games in here and a nice little book which has got some cool little novellas and things included in it. And these are basically your kind of Hobbit type text adventures, but you've got some rather nice graphics, and this is a cool game. I'll definitely be coming back to this one, except it's been a long time since I played these games. I do remember back in the day when I played The Hobbit on the Spectrum, getting stuck in a barrel and kind of staying there for what seemed like months and never being able to advance in the game. And I was kind of reminded about this when, yes, you are lost in the forest. Yeah, being lost in the forest. I kind of miss these games. When games were primitive, the early DOS games, this kind of game, I kind of feel it makes you use your head, imagination. It makes you use your imagination, not so much your brain power. As Albert Einstein said, intelligence is not the sum of your knowledge. It's more based on imagination. I kind of agree with that. I think having everything served to you on a plate, imagination-wise, so your head's not creating the game world. It's just accepting what's put in front of you. You might be solving the problems and following the story, but you're not having to imagine the situation, which is kind of a miss, I think. But this machine is capable of doing some very cool graphics. So here we've got Star Glider 2. This isn't my footage. This isn't on my machine, but my machine is capable of doing this. And the files are out there. I just don't have the means of getting them onto the machine right now using the floppy drive. I could put a GoTech in there, in which case you can get many, many images of excellent games and play them. I don't really want to do that right now. I might be forced to do it ultimately, but I'm going to, the ways and means of getting the images off a PC onto these 3-inch drives, I might look at it, doing it that way first of all, see how I go. So basically there's two things I'm going to do with this machine. I'm going to use that database and do a bit of tracking of my retro gear, which will be cool. I'm also going to try and get hold of some more business software, plotting software, communication software, that kind of stuff, just because I don't really collect that kind of stuff, and it'd be nice to have a machine with sort of a dedicated business sort of slant on it from my collecting point of view. And then at some point I'll really look into the games and try and get as many as I can, and we'll possibly have a look at all of that in the future. In the meantime, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope you consider leaving comments and subscribing and thumbing up and all the rest of it. And yeah, hopefully you'll join me on the next video. Thanks for watching, and see you later.